Good evening, everyone in Indonesia. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the session, The Future of Mobility. And this online conference is organized by Goethe-Institut Indonesia, Center for Digital Society and Engaged Media. My name is Janitra Haryanto, or you can call me Janitra or Jay. I will be your moderator for the session. Now, I'll probably just introduce myself a bit before we start. So I'm a researcher and public policy consultant with specific focus on the risk associated with technology and public policy itself. I'm currently studying public policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And I'm happy to be here to moderate our event with Max Tauschhuber. And we're going to talk about self-driving cars and its legal and ethical dilemmas. Now, a bit introduction before we start. We know that self-driving cars already exist right now. And this technology is set to rapidly change how people move in urban spaces. Despite the growing industry, we also know that there are many unanswered questions. Questions such as, for example, if a car is automated, then who should be responsible in an accident with a self-driving car, right? What if a car had to choose between two people in a life-threatening accident, for example? And most importantly, how should we regulate autonomous vehicles at large? Now, if you have questions, you are welcome to type them below during our event, and we will have time afterwards for a Q&A session. And we'll try our best to answer all of your questions so long as the time permits. Now, before I start this event, let me just introduce you to Max. So Max studied law and European law at the Julius Maximilian University of Würzburg. His focus is on technology law, and he is also a research assistant at the RobotLaw Research Center. Hi, Max, how are you doing?
Hi, welcome. Thank you. I'm fine, and I'm very excited to begin my presentation soon.
Sure. Okay, so probably without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to find my presentation. Okay, you should see it now.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you again very much for the kind invitation and the friendly introduction to my work. It's not easy for a lawyer to speak at such an event because I guess we lawyers have a reputation for being boring, even dull, and most importantly, we are full of worries all the time. So I think the only reason to speak here today is to bring you back from the heights back down to earth, so to speak, to the realities of life. And yeah, as said, a lawyer, we all know that autonomous driving, autonomous systems in general have many implications on the law. Just think about liability for damages, criminal negligence, or data protection law. But since I only know the legal aspects in Germany, I will try to concentrate on the ethics of autonomous driving. And one might think that fundamental ethical questions would play a lesser role in the context of new technologies. But this assumption, in my opinion, is completely inaccurate. Rather, the opposite is true. These ethical issues I will be presenting are in some cases so pressing that the technical implementation of the system depends on their solution. So let's begin. First of all, you could ask why are ethics even important in this context? Well, it is firstly to ensure the acceptance of these new technologies. If the technologies are not accepted by the population, they cannot be sold, of course. There's also a threat of backlash in a way that people think they are going to lose control over their life and a lot of other things. So this acceptance aspect is a first important point of view that speaks for dealing with ethics. A second point of view is perhaps to be seen in the fact that in this way, it can be ensured that the social order and also the legal order remain human-oriented. Because only by considering now how this development is to be shaped normatively, we can ensure that the social order remains oriented toward human beings and does not develop in a different direction. There are indeed countries in which the human being is not the center of attention, so to speak. Just think of theocracies where priests decide everything. And also, of course, this existed in Europe for a long time. Or just think about totalitarian states. We are in Germany especially affected by that, historically speaking, where the ideology was, you are nothing, your people are everything. So there is nothing to be seen there of orientation towards the individual. So in order to preserve our human orientation, we should really behave wisely in the face of this technical revolution. And this includes, in particular, rising ethical questions at an early stage. And thirdly, and finally, ethics is always groundwork for policy or legal policy. Ethical considerations are at the beginning of legal policy decisions. So there's no contradiction really between ethics and law. You could say that legal policy is the intersection between ethics and law. So it makes sense to deal intensively with ethical issues. In my opinion, there is nothing worse than, for example, lawyers who say ethics do not interest me at all. But, and here comes a big but, some claim that it's very difficult to find ethical orientations or guidelines. For example, after the decline of the importance of religions and the religious pluralization, it is problematic to find binding ethical guidelines for technical developments. And I am not of this opinion, because one should see, first of all, ethics is much older than most religions we know. For example, Aristoteles, who wrote his ethics already 500 before Christ. That was already a very sophisticated ethical theory. And of course, ethical reflection existed even before that. And furthermore, we can rely on certain humanistic ideals that emerged or were rediscovered in the early modern period after they had already been discussed in ancient world. So these are humankind as the center of law, humankind as the center of society, human dignity, and of course, human rights. These principles have been enforced or even been enforced against religions, so that one must say that the decline in the importance of religion is not a great challenge for the question of ethics. The question now is, however, what kind of rules do we want to apply to technology? There are many different morals and correspondingly many different ethics, but I think that there are certain basic assumptions, even worldwide, that almost everybody would follow. For example, not to deliberately harm others for no reason in their life, in physical integrity, in their honor, or in their property. So you see, respect for others seem to be a kind of basic commandment that can be generally applied and be used to give these machines a normative framework. Furthermore, these basic rules also include respect for the autonomy of the individual, that is the ability of the individual to make decisions. So private autonomy also plays a major role. So I think there are a lot of ethical principles that all social groups can agree on, and it's necessary to implement these rules in the regulation of machines. So long story short, there's a core problem, and I assume that is why I was invited, a core problem that is discussed again and again in the context of autonomous driving. And Jay already mentioned it. It's the dilemma problem that is often described as follows. A vehicle is approaching an accident scenario at high speed. Here on the slide, I try to illustrate the situation so you can imagine it a little bit better. I'm not that artsy, please forgive. And there are 3 seriously injured people lying on the ground. A 4th one has managed to escape on the side of the road and is leaning against a roadside post, for example. A human driver would not be able to react quickly enough and would run over and kill these 3 seriously injured people lying on the ground. The machine, with the help of its sensors and its super fast computing power, however, has the possibility to take an evasive action, and instead of killing the 3, only the 1 on the side. And the question now is the following. Should the car be programmed to take evasive action in such situations, killing the single person on the side of the road, or should it continue and run over the 3 people lying on the ground? This is basically the dilemma problem with autonomous driving. And it is worth noting that problems of this kind are really ancient. So they are fundamental questions, as I said in the beginning. The first historical known text in which such a problem was discussed is the so-called plank of Carneades. Carneades was a Greek philosopher in the 2nd century BC. Rome had already taken over the known world. The Romans were dominating. They had become somewhat arrogant, and this Carneades traveled from Athens to Rome to show the Romans that although the Greeks were militarily inferior, they were still intellectually on top. And to do this, he formed different cases to make clear to the Romans that they imagined perfect Roman ethics and Roman legal system has its deficits and cannot solve certain cases. And the most famous case of this kind is just called the plank of Carneades. So imagine there are 2 people floating on a plank in the Mediterranean Sea after a shipwreck. Let's call them Rose and Jack. And this plank gets soaked with water, and it becomes clear that very soon the plank will sink and both will drown. Carneades now asked his audience, may Rose now push Jack off the plank? If she pushes him down, at least she survives. Or is it not rather that Jack may push down Rose to keep on living? Or is it better that no one pushes down one another, but then they both die, of course? This is indeed a difficult and complicated problem. And there are many proposed solutions that run through the intellectual history until our time. And another example is the well-known case during the National Socialism era in Germany. There were the so-called murders of the sick. The Nazis came up with the idea of murdering patients of psychiatric institutions to relieve the society of their burden, they called it. And they asked the administrators of these mental institutions to hand over the sick so that it could be gassed, so killed basically. And many administrators did so. Some refused, but then they were killed themselves by the Nazis. And a few proceeded in such a way that they sacrificed a certain percentage of their patients in order to save the majority. And these cases came before the courts after the war, and the German courts decided that although it was morally understandable, it was still illegal. It is unlawful to kill innocent people, even if you want to save others with it. And a famous German criminal law scholar formulated an even more famous case, the Switchman case. He formulated the following scenario. Imagine a wagon comes loose from a train and rolls down a slope and threatens to kill 5 people who are working on the tracks downhill. But there is a switchman, and he could change the switch and turn the switch from 5 to kill to 1 to kill. And the question is now, is the switchman allowed to do that? And this criminal law scholar said, no, he may not, that remains illegal. And then a British philosopher, Mrs. Foote, translated this example into English, called it the trolley problem, and made the example very famous. So in the Anglo-Saxon world, there are whole libraries on the trolley problem. Unfortunately, Mrs. Foote forgot to name the German criminal law scholar, whose name, by the way, was Mr. Welzel, as the author of the example. That's why she became famous with it and not him, but we in the criminal law science, we use every opportunity to mention his name. And last but not least, I have another example. A few years ago, the German parliament enacted a new law, the Air Security Act, which was constructed in a similar way. The law authorized the German armed forces to shoot down fully loaded passenger airplanes that were hijacked by terrorists and were intended to be used as weapons against other people. The question here was, are you allowed to shoot this plane, which has been hijacked by terrorists, to crash into a building in Berlin, for example? And the German Constitutional Court ruled that this regulation was unconstitutional. The judges made a distinction between the terrorists on board the plane, who of course may be killed to prevent significant danger to the life of others, and on the other hand, the passengers, who are merely innocent on board of the plane. An innocent person is not obligated to sacrifice his or her life for the sake of others, no matter how many can be saved by doing so. You see, all these examples are exactly on the line of the problem of Carneades and exactly on the line of Welzel and also Mrs. Foote. And that means that we have certain theory offerings to deal with this dilemma situations in autonomous driving. The core question of the problem is one life as much worth as many lives? And can one be obliged to sacrifice oneself so that others may survive? There are mainly two opposing factions. Utilitarians and representatives of other consequence-oriented ethics tend to say that in this case, you are allowed to kill one person to save many others, and followers of Kant would probably reject it. Thus, unexpectedly, we have entered into one of the great debates of practical philosophy via the problem of the so-called algorithms of death. And according to Kant, each individual human being has dignity and no price, and therefore cannot or must not be made the subject of a trade-off. Consequently, one could argue that it makes no difference whether 1 or 100 lives are lost. You are not allowed to save them by killing one other person. However, in view of the suffering caused not only to the victims themselves, but also their relatives and friends, this position seems morally quite dubious. Of course, it sounds noble to say that one human life weighs as much as several, even infinite human lives. However, this view can turn out to be highly problematic in reality. And the consensus, at least in Germany, where I am from, and I'm eager to hear about the audience's opinion, the consensus in Germany is following the philosophy of Kant, actually, and proclaims that it remains unlawful to kill innocent people, so it's not legal to kill this one to save 4 or 3 others. The killing of innocent people remains unlawful. Only there are situations where this principle has to be modified or thought over or further, because it gets more difficult to assess when the potential victims were in the same dangerous situation from the beginning. You see, your cases or our cases involve the killing of innocent bystanders to save other people. But what about situations where all the involved parties are in the same life-threatening danger? The following example. Imagine a very narrow one-way street is driven by a car. The car cannot drive to the left or to the right. Now, suddenly 3 children jump onto the road, one in front, or going in front, the brave one, and 2 behind following. The car would normally hit all 3. In front of the left fender is the one child that is in the very front, and in front of the right fender are the 2 other that rushed after. And as I said, the car would normally hit all 3 and most certainly kill them. But the car is now equipped with a tech system and have the possibility to make a minimal steering impulse to the left or right. Now the question is, what should the car do? Should it just go straight, or should the car set a slight steering impulse to the left, then only one child is killed? Or should it set a light steering impulse to the right, then 2 children are killed and 1 survives? And from the sense of justice and from the sense of morality of most people, it is probably so that in such situations, it is necessary to quantify life. In other words, to quantify life and to say that if innocent people have to die, then please kill as few as possible. And in this case, kill 1 child. But one could also argue that man is not allowed to play fate, and the car is not allowed to play fate either. So just drive straight ahead, but then all 3 would be killed. And last but not least, I have a little thought impulse for you, another thought impulse. Because interesting problems also arise when the onboard computer decides that the life of its own driver must be sacrificed. And just imagine driver A, for example, we call him A, has just purchased for a lot of money a large premium car with numerous autonomous features, including some crash algorithms. And during the first test drive, A is driving through a tunnel at high speed when a tire suddenly blows out on a packed school bus in front of him. And the school bus flips onto its side and turns sideways. And in a fraction of a second, the car's crash system now calculates that braking is no longer possible. Instead of steering the car at high speed onto the oncoming lane occupied by numerous smaller cars, the onboard system turns the car toward a massive concrete pillar on the right edge of the tunnel. And the driver's display, for example, still briefly shows the message, take care and thanks for everything. And then the car hits the concrete pillar at full speed. The decision to sacrifice its own driver in order to protect the lives of the school children and the drivers of the much smaller cars on the opposite side of the road was, of course, rational for the system. 1 life is worth less than many lives. But it remains a question if a car whose onboard computing is set to consistently kill its own driver in relevant traffic situations find many bias. And with this, I would be at the end of my little presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm curious to hear about your opinions.
Thank you, Max. This is a very profound thought, and I believe this is not something that we can just, get an answer of very quick, right? Because these questions are big questions, and I can also see that some of them are actually it's very scenario based to a sense. Like you're saying, at first we can be a Kantian, but then when you're faced with the situations, say when you really have to choose between killing 2 person or killing 1 person, then which one would you choose? You can be a utilitarian in that sense. But I'm curious about how the regulators should do in here, because I would say probably in a more practical level, autonomous cars are largely unregulated, right? And this is especially true in Southeast Asia, I think, except for Singapore, I would say, because we don't have the technologies yet. So maybe if we can learn how we should set it, it doesn't have to be how we should regulate them in terms of mitigating the risk or preventing the risk, but also how we should perceive it in a broader level. How should we take the decision of this autonomous robots? Should we attribute their behavior to their makers, which is the creators, the developers? Should we attribute it to the car makers? And if we attribute it to the car makers, what if it happens in a way that the car maker collaborate with the developer, for example? Then who, with an outside developer, then who would be taken into responsibility here in that sense? Do you have any take on this in a more practical level, and that's related with this ethical concern?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you also said that we don't have the time here today to discuss a solution on this dilemma problem. And to be quite frankly, we don't have a solution at the moment. And the other part of your question, I think if we could find a solution, the solution should be written in law, of course, and should be binding to all car makers, because just imagine the car makers would be free in programming their cars, and there would be some kind of competition among the car makers that they will program their car so that the car will always attribute the highest priority to the life of the driver or the passenger, and make advertisements about that. So people are definitely only buying a car who is binded to save their own life and not the life of others, even if it would be the better solution in a special case. So I think it should be regulated by the lawmaker. And you also said autonomous driving is not yet regulated. I can say for Germany, we have a new law here since last year. We got a new Road Traffic Act. And this traffic act allows completely driverless, so fully autonomous vehicles in defined operational areas. And just to give a little insight, this law is important for the transport of goods, for example, or people on fixed routes, for example, shuttle buses or something like that, should be legal in Germany now, and don't need a control person in the vehicle at the moment. So we already have a law. And the funny thing is that this law says that the car should be equipped with an accident avoidance or crash prevention system, which is designed to avoid or reduce damage. And now the law states, in the event of an unavoidable alternative damage to different legal interests, for example, so you have a situation where the car is about to hit a human being, and this car calculates that it could drive to the right side, and instead of hitting a human being, it would hit another car which is just parking there. Then this system must take into account the importance of the legal interests and give the highest priority to the protection of human life. So that's basically or completely understandable that the car should always prioritize human life. And now the law says that in the event of an unavoidable alternative risk to human life, so exactly our examples we just discussed, it must not give any further weighing, excuse my English, on the basis of personal characteristics. So for the case of unavoidable alternative endangerment of human life, it is prohibited to take in account personal characteristics such as the age, the sex, or physical or mental constitution. But what the car makers should do to avoid this or do instead, that's something the legislator did not dare to make a final regulation. So even the lawmaker in Germany just says it's not allowed to kill someone based on their age or sex or other stuff, but it doesn't say what the car should do instead.
Thank you for the answer. I'll probably just jump into the Q&A session first because we have one question from an anonymous attendee. And I think I would like to short this question first because this is related to my previous question. So the question is, how far can we hold engineers or developers accountable for self-driving cars? Do you think AI ethics lessons or guidelines relevant for engineers in those companies, in a sense?
Well, that's a very good question concerning basically every AI system, and it's also a difficult one. Maybe I can illustrate by giving you another example, a concrete example out of Germany. In the spring of 2012, I guess, a vehicle equipped with a lane keeping assistant drove at high speed into a town, and not far from my hometown here at Würzburg. And at the entrance to this town, the driver suffered a stroke and he lost most of his consciousness, but was still able to clinch to the steering wheel of the car. And in the process, he jerked the wheel to the right so that under normal circumstances, the car would have come to a stop in the bushes before entering the town. The lane keeping assistant, however, guided the car back onto the road while the driver was unconscious. And the car then entered the village at high speed and hit a woman and her small child in the center of the village, killing them both instantly, while the father was able to save himself by jumping to the side and only suffered an injury to his leg, I think it was. So basically the driver was unconscious for the whole time, and therefore you can speak of an autonomous system killing those two persons. And from a civil law perspective, it's simple, because according to German law, damages have to be paid by the holder of the car, even if he is not at fault for this example. So it's just you own a car, and then you are obligated to pay any damages the car created. So the holder has to pay for the burial costs and the mother and daughter and the medical costs of the father. The problem was now that the surviving father said, I want to know who killed my family. He wanted to know who is to blame, understandably. And this is where criminal law came in, and the state prosecutor tried to find out who is responsible for this accident. Of course, not the car, because according to our law, a car cannot be a criminal. But what about the producer of the car? And the producer argued that they knew that the lane keeping assistant is not perfect, but they did a lot of tests and found out that it was a better system than anything else that was on the market at the time of the introduction. So this system was the best possible system available. And the state prosecutor was convinced by that argument and decided that there was no negligence by the producer or the developer. And also the driver himself was not to blame, of course, because he did nothing wrong. He just suffered an unfortunate stroke. And in the end, there was no one responsible in a criminal sense. So it's a very difficult question. And at the moment, when the system you are introducing to the market is at the best possible state of the art, then I think it's difficult to attribute any kind of responsibility to the developer or the producer of the system.
How about putting the blame to the driver itself? In that case, say in a case where in that case the driver was incapable to be fully conscious of the surrounding, right? How if the driver was actually able to be conscious of the surrounding, but reflex-wise, you wouldn't be able to grab the steer and to control the car. So in cases like this, does this mean the driver cannot be held responsible, because at the end of the day, it's the system who controls it, and says there's an accident? Or what's your take on this kind of scenario?
When you have an autonomous car, then you basically have no driver in the sense of a driver. You have a passenger. And the German law, for example, declares that the system should be able to drive on its own. And if the system realizes that it's approaching a situation it cannot solve, then it should make the passenger aware, so the passenger can take over the wheel and solve the situation by himself. Either that, or the lawmaker also introduced a so-called technical oversight. So that's a person in a remote place sitting on a computer all the day with many monitors and displays, and all the cars in Germany, autonomous driving cars, can call on this technical supervisor to ask him for help for a specific situation. And that's the thing with autonomous cars, that when you're inside of one, it's hardly, the passenger is hardly to blame for any accidents, because he uses the car as a passenger and not as a driver.
Even if this is a personal car. Sorry to cut you there. Even if this is a personal car.
Yeah, even if it's a personal car.
Okay.
And it's an autonomous car, and you use it how it should be used. So you read the instructions of the car maker, and you behave normally like a normal passenger. Then it's difficult to attribute any responsibility to that passenger.
Okay, that's great. I want to move to another question, and that is an industry that's related with car and accidents, and that is the insurance industry, right? How do you think this will change the car insurance industry? In the case of Germany, for example, how do they accept this new law?
Well, basically, driverless cars are always better than human drivers. So we all want autonomous driving because we want to reduce the number of accidents, and we want to reduce the number of dead people on the streets. And so I think the insurance companies would be happy to have many driverless cars in Germany, because then they have less accidents to pay for. But another problem or aspect is that, I mean, you maybe also already realized that driverless cars lead to situations in which there is no one to blame. And that's sometimes a little bit difficult to understand, because human beings always want to blame someone. And sometimes there are damages occurring and someone has to pay for them. And it's suggested that insurance companies have to come up with the payment for these damages, and there have to be large amount of funds pouring into special funds that cover every accident happening with driverless cars. So there are two sides of the medal, basically.
Interesting. I want to move to another question, from anonymous attendee. So the question is, some of us think that we want to use autonomous car to reduce the negative impact conventional car has to the environment, right? What makes us have to use this autonomous car in our daily life other than that? Of course, for convenience, but do you really think this is sort of the future? Because if I try to hook it up to the other questions next, some cities around the world have been trying to move away from car first mobility, right? And they're trying to develop a more robust public transportation system. So in this case, do you think self-driving cars will really be the future of humankind? Or do you have any comments on the seemingly contradictory development in other part of the world, if you have any, if you come across that?
So for me personally, I hope that we won't have any cars in the future and public transport will be much more important. That's my opinion, but I'm afraid, I guess, that autonomous cars will be part of the future, definitely. And there will be a phase where normal cars and autonomous cars will be side by side on the streets and much more common. And there will be other problems concerning that. Yeah, I think that autonomous cars will be the future. Yeah, basically.
Okay. In the interest of time, I would like to also move to the next question, because so this question is about data, right? So who owns the data generated by self-driving cars? Is there any regulations around this, or this would be under the umbrella regulations of the GDPR in the case of EU?
Well, I'm not a data protection expert, but all I can say is that at least for German standards, data is not something you can own, basically. It's for German law, we have things you can own, like you can touch them and you can own them, but everything you can't touch, you can't own. So who owns data is something I, as a German lawyer, don't understand the question, basically, because you can't own data. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, the driver of a car has an interest in keeping control over the data which the car is producing over its life cycle. But most importantly, the car manufacturer has the most interest in gathering all their data from the cars they sold, and to improve them, basically, to collect data on the functionality of the car. And yeah, I think that they should do some kind of contract when buying a car. You should sign a contract that you allowing the car producer to access these data provided by the car. Hope that answered it a little bit.
I'd like to ask a little bit deeper in that. So how about if you buy a car and then I haven't actually been in a Tesla before, like any other electric cars or autonomous cars, but how if you happen to buy a car and then there's some of your data that is being recorded inside that car, and so this data would be constituted as a, please correct me if I'm wrong, but probably as a personal data too, right? As for, there would be conversations, there would be so in that sense, do you treat this data differently, as in the data that is gathered by the car manufacturers as to how many miles have you driven your car, and then where do you turn, what might be the potential problem, and the data that might be considered as a personal data, like where do you use your car to go to? Then if they do probably record voices inside a car for voice recognitions, for example, do you have an idea about this? If they treat the data differently in this sense?
I don't think that this is possible, because according to the GDPR, almost everything is protected by these regulations. Because you have to see, the car itself is your car. And when the car manufacturer wants to know if for example, how long the car is already driven, how many kilometers, etc., then it's a data about something you own. So it's also protected by the GDPR. So I don't think there are any data on the car which are not protected by the GDPR for the owner. So the owner has to be asked about anything concerning the car, even if it's not just a conversation. So everything.
Okay. I want to move to the next question, and this is a question that I don't actually quite fully get this question, but if you could get this question, I would just read it to you. So from anonymous attendee, there's a speculation that driverless cars will make the idea of a car ownership obsolete. What do you think of this?
Well, there is the trend that you share cars. There are many providers of car sharing platforms, but I don't think that has something to do with autonomous driving. I mean, I can imagine that autonomous cars will accelerate this process to share cars, but I don't think that they are interdependent. So it's also something I would like to see in the future, more car sharing and more public transport. But I think that car sharing will not be better or worse without autonomous driving.
That's a good idea. I even think, when you mention about how people will think autonomous car and this could be the future, so to say, I actually think that once it becomes more affordable, it can actually become a boom in Southeast Asia or probably in Asia, because we have a huge market for this. And I think, I'm not sure if this is the case also in Germany, but you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong. I would say this might also be your case, right? In the case of Indonesia, it's still considered as a privilege for you to have a car. And a car, it's just not only the fact that you can drive a car, but it's also a sign that you can afford a car, right? Let alone an expensive car. So do you think this is also the same driver as to why driverless car or autonomous car will still be the future in Germany or in any other parts of Europe, for example?
When you see cars as a status symbol, then it doesn't matter if it's autonomous or not autonomous. It's still very expensive and can be used as a status symbol. Did I get that wrong? Or
no, I get that. I get that. No, I think I associate autonomous car as an expensive car because definitely it's expensive, right? In a sense, it's not a technology that you have in the cars for now, and it's usually branded in a sense. Not many people can actually buy that. But yeah, maybe in the future we should really just think about making our public transportation becoming autonomous instead of making more of private autonomous car. Although I don't see it as right. Although I don't see it as a future in Asia because we have too many people to employ. In the sense, so maybe people would still want to do that unless you can distribute that somehow, to distribute their contribution somehow to maybe the manufacturer of the car, autonomous car, or whatever. There's a new question here from Sifa Nurjana. So the question is, in Indonesia, many people depend on their life as online motorcycle taxi driver. So, gig economy. If there's an autonomous vehicle, is this also a challenge in terms of work? Because the driver will also be unemployed, right? So, or is there something else that they can do? Has this happened? Has this happened right now in Germany?
No, we don't. As I said, we have a law allowing autonomous cars basically on special designated areas. And we have some pilot projects where shuttle buses are driverless, but it's not something which happens in all of Germany. And of course, thank you for the question. It's a very important question, and it's a question concerning nearly all new technologies and artificial intelligence especially. And I don't really have an answer for that because it's a very old problem when you say or when you are afraid that robots will take over your job. That's understandable. And then the argument against that, I suppose, to ease your worries is, yeah, well, you could switch jobs and help produce those robots, but that's something completely unrealistic from my point of view. So when you're driving a motorcycle in Indonesia, you can't just switch to helping produce autonomous motorcycles and make a living of that. So that's completely unrealistic. But I think that will be a problem, and the society needs to address this. So we should see some help programs for these affected people. And yeah, I think, as I said, it will be the future, autonomous driving, and there will be jobs lost. But it's a job of the society to help ease that transition.
But probably one more question related to this. Do you think the government should really think of this as a serious issue in the next 2 to 5 years? Do you think we can really? Do you think there would be? Do you think the skid drivers will be replaced by the robots in a sense?
In 2 to 5 years?
In 2 to 5 years.
Nah, I don't think so. It will take a little bit longer because I repeat myself, but I will do it anyway. I told you about the law, the new Traffic Act in Germany. And everybody is happy that Germany is so modern and they are innovators in that regard. And you can basically drive an autonomous car on German streets, but in reality, it's different because, as I said, the lawmaker said that the car should be equipped with a crash avoidance system, and this crash avoidance system should distinct between human life and property damage, and always give human life the highest priority. But in reality, there are sensors for cars, and there are cars who can realize that a person is standing in front of them, but it's not a technology ready to be part of the whole market. So it's still pilot projects and very closed applications, but not something we will see on the public streets for the next 3 to 5 years, because it's much too dangerous, in my opinion, to have these kind of cars on the streets.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. Thank you, Max, for coming here and discussing with us, sharing your opinion. Do you have any closing remarks before we conclude our discussion today?
Well, thank you, Jay, for the invitation. Also, thank you for the very good organization of this event. And we talked before, I would love to visit Indonesia sometime, and maybe the next iteration of this conference will be offline again. And yeah, thank you everyone for your questions, and I wish you all the best and have fun with the next session.
Okay, we look forward to you coming here, Max. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this event. So the next session will be the automation and the end of work. So I think this is probably a little bit related to us. And we'll start in 30 minutes. It will center around the question of what will shape our working lives in the future. So if you are still interested to find out I wouldn't say answers, but probably more questions about how the future of work will be, feel free to join our event in the next 30 minutes. And as to Max and me, we'll conclude this discussion today. Thank you so much for coming to our event, to our session, and we'll see you in other opportunities, probably in the next 30 minutes in the next iteration of this session. Thank you so much, everyone. See ya.